Namaskar, and welcome to episode number 18 of the Indologia Podcast. On February 27th of this year, the members of Sri Ram Sena staged a protest outside the Hindalka Central Jail after the jail authorities denied them permission to perform a puja to a portrait of VD Savarkar on jail premises on his 58th death anniversary. So the activists shouted slogans against the government and performed the puja to a Savarkar portrait outside the jail premises. Some BJP workers also joined the protest because Savarkar was kept in Hindalka jail for almost 100 days from April 4th to July the 13th, 1950. Yes, you've heard that right. 1950, after India got the independence, the so-called independence, what I prefer to call the transfer of power. And people have long been demanding a statue, the installation of a statue of Savarkar in front of that particular jail. A picture was installed on 29th of December 2022. Swatantra Veer Savarkar's picture was installed in the Hindalka jail in the presence of the then State Education Minister, B.C. Nagesh. But later, once the power changed, the picture was removed. But the question here is that why was Savarkar in Hindalka jail and why was he jailed in 1950 after the supposed independence of India? Because everybody knows that Veer Savarkar spent a lot of time in jail. It was the cellular jail in the Andaman or it was the jail in Ratnagiri. But why was he jailed in Hindalka in 1950? What if I told you that he was arrested not just by the British, but he was also jailed by Indians too? And for such petty reasons that will anger any self-respecting patriot Indian. Savarkar was kept under preventive detention in the Hindalka Central Prison for 4 months in 1950. And he was kept under preventive detention at the orders of Prime Minister Nehru in an attempt to stop him from protesting against the visit of the Pakistani Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan. Nehru was so threatened, so scared of Savarkar that in order to please this Pakistani Prime Minister who was visiting Delhi, Nehru jailed Savarkar. Nehru ordered Savarkar to be jailed as a so-called precautionary measure. And to get more details on this particular incident, I will go to the excellent book written by Vikram Sampath, Savarkar, A Contested Legacy. Vikram writes, Nehru invited his Pakistani counterpart, Liaquat Ali Khan, to Delhi to sign the Nehru Liaquat Pact on 8th of April 1950. The bilateral treaty was aimed at a safe return of refugees and a protection of the rights of minorities in both the countries, something that Pakistan never followed up on, in letter or in spirit. Minority commissions were set up in both countries, and more than 1 million refugees migrated from East Pakistan to West Bengal. But in a completely unexpected and draconian move, the Nehru government swooped down on all its political opponents within the country, especially the Hindu Mahasabha, in a spate of nationwide arrests under the Preventive Detention Act of 1950. Even before the dawn of 4th of April 1950, nearly 100 policemen of Bombay's CID divided themselves into different groups under Operation Hindu Mahasabha. Orders had been received in the late hours of the previous night, and the officers had burnt the midnight oil, making frantic preparations to carry out the morning's lightning raids. Working on a clockwork schedule, the officers carried out the raid on several leaders. An officer knocked on Savarkar's house too by daybreak and showed him a warrant of arrest. And this when Savarkar had not even made any anti-government or anti-Nehru statements. He was just given time to finish his morning ablutions and taken to a waiting police conveyance and driven off to the Arthur Road jail. Nearly a dozen other leaders of the Hindu Mahasabha were rounded up in Bombay and Pune. Similar raids were carried out in other parts of India as well. The high-handed attitude of the government was squarely condemned by several people and the press. The Free Press Journal, not known to be sympathetic towards the Hindu Mahasabha, commented, "The offensive against the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS leaders and workers has only one implication, that is, that Premier Nehru has elected to appease Pakistan and imperil the integrity and the independence of India. The offensive against the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS had a twofold purpose. One is to divert India's attention from the policy of appeasement. The other is to create a panic that there is a Hindu conspiracy and rally the progressive elements in support of the policy of appeasement of Pakistan. On his part, Nehru took recourse to Section 3 of the Preventive Detention Act that mentions any affront made to a foreign power as being a valid reason to detain a person. He noted that the speeches of the Hindu Mahasabha leaders demand the liquidation of Pakistan. I can imagine no greater offense to a foreign power than to make such a suggestion, Nehru said. All the Mahasabha leaders made representations denying the charges that they were out to create ill will between Hindus and Muslims or were conspiring to end the lives of prominent national leaders. The charges had no substance or proof, but were merely the paranoia of Nehru and his government. It was a clear attempt to completely eliminate political opposition, especially in the wake of the upcoming first general elections that the country was to witness in 1951. So as Vikram wrote in the book, Nehru was so paranoid and he has always cared about his international image. And just for that, he rounded up all the leaders of Hindu Mahasabha, including VD Savarkar and the leaders of RSS, put them in jail just because the Pakistani Prime Minister was visiting. And why was the Pakistani Prime Minister visiting? Because he was coming to sign the Liaquat Nehru Pact. So on this particular visit of the Pakistani Prime Minister Liaquat Khan, Nehru would go on to make yet another blunder, the blunder of the Liaquat Nehru Pact, which, in the words of Conrad Elst, prevents the government of India from any form of interference when Hindus are maltreated in Pakistan and its partial successor state, Bangladesh. Those of you who know what the hostage population theory is, well, it is a theory that says that the Pakistanis held the Hindus and Sikhs hostage in their country, so that in case India tortured its Muslim population or put the Muslim population of its country into great peril, which of course they thought would happen, considering that they themselves had all the plans to put the Hindus and Sikhs under subjection, like they had pretty much started doing before the partition itself. So they expected that the Hindus, the Indians, would do the same thing to the Muslims of India. So the Hindus and Sikhs of Pakistan were the hostages who would bear the brunt in case India were to subject its Muslim population to any sort of adversities. But of course, the Pakistanis did not realize that Chacha had no love for Hindus to begin with. Nehru hated the Hindus as much as the British did, the British that he was so desperate to emulate. And this is not just some conjecture, I'm not making some conjecture here. Nehru himself had told the American economist John Galbraith, he said, "You realize, Galbraith, that I am the last Englishman to rule in India." So Nehru saw himself, oddly enough, as an Englishman, as a steward of the Gora Sahibs who had left India for him to watch over. But what exactly was the Liaquat Nehru Pact? To explain this, I'll read you an excerpt from Unbreaking India, a book by Sanjay Dikshit. He writes, "Jinnah and his followers convinced the Muslims in India, in every nook and corner, that a separate Pakistan was just a temporary hijrat, an exile into a Medina, where the believers will gather strength and then, in a manner of their prophet, reconquer the Mecca of mainland India. So they set about to accomplish their task with a single-minded passion, by either driving away most of the non-Muslim population out of the territories they had occupied, or by forcibly converting them. When the international uproar became too much and Indians started retaliating, a pact known as the Delhi Pact or the Liaquat Nehru Pact was signed on 8th of April 1950 to mutually protect the minorities in both the countries. Using this as an excuse, Pakistan stopped taking in any more Muslims from India in 1951, leaving nearly 9% of populations of Muslims in India, even as they reduced non-Muslims in West Pakistan to less than 4%. The pact was hailed as the new Treaty of Hudaybiyah by the New Medina. The Quranic imagery was played out in full measure, leaving only the task of reconquering the Mecca that the believers had temporarily left. For those of you who do not know the Islamic history, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was a treaty that the Prophet of Islam and his followers signed with the people of Mecca because they wanted to do the Hajj at the Kaaba. And Kaaba at that time was a temple of pagan gods. And one of the gods was Allah. So these new Muslims that were converted by the Prophet also wanted to do the Hajj. But because they were constantly fighting with the Meccans were very wary of them. So the Muslims said that, hey, look, let's sign a peace treaty that we'll not fight each other for 10 years and we can go to each other's territories, etc. So the Meccans, who were peace-loving people, and because they were polytheists, they believed in lots of gods, they did not believe in only one true God, they did not believe in forcibly converting the people to their religions. They said, okay, let's sign a peace treaty. So the Muslims signed a peace treaty. But what was not known to the Meccans was that hidden away, secretly, the Muslims were regaining strength. They were recruiting people for the army, they were buying the weapons, they were becoming stronger. So the peace treaty that was signed up for 10 years did not even last a couple of years, because just after 2 years, the Muslims attacked the Meccans and completely broke their promise and voided the treaty. So what the writer is saying here, what Sanjay Dikshit is saying in this particular section is that this Nehru Liaquat Pact was the new Treaty of Hudaybiyah. Because Pakistanis said, okay, we'll take care of the minorities, so do you, and let's stop the flow of minorities from one side to another. And yet, the Muslim population kept increasing. The Muslim population coming into India kept increasing. And the Hindus were not allowed to leave Pakistan. The Hindus remained there at the whims and mercies of the Pakistani Muslims. And as most of us know today, what a sad state the Hindus and Sikhs of Pakistan live in today. It is said that 51% of all Hindus in Pakistan are bonded labor, practically slaves. So this is all thanks to this idiotic Liaquat Nehru Pact. And there is another thing that the writer mentions here, which I think is very, very important. He says, it should also be remembered very clearly that undivided India was split into a Muslim and a non-Muslim state, and not into a Muslim and a Hindu state, according to the Mountbatten Plan of 3rd of June 1947, which was signed by both Congress and Muslim League and announced the same day in the British Parliament by the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee. The Congress leaders agreed to this particular treaty, and the only opposition to this was by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who was then a minister in the Nehru cabinet, and he resigned, citing the Nehru Liaquat Pact as the reason. And he said that this particular pact had betrayed the Hindus in East Pakistan. He was also an advocate of a complete transfer of population. And as Mr. Mukherjee had predicted, the Liaquat Nehru Pact was an absolute disaster. As the head of RSS, Mohan Bhagwat, said in 2021, the Nehru Liaquat Pact clearly stated that each country would protect its minorities. India has been following it. Pakistan failed to do so. The provisions of CAA are meant for those who were prosecuted in those countries and came to India for refuge. The aftermath of the Liaquat Nehru Pact is nothing but disaster. As I said before, this pact was signed on 8th of April 1950 to mutually protect the minorities in both the countries. And using this as an excuse, Pakistan stopped taking in any more Muslims from India in 1951. Because the traffic of minorities going from here to there was stopped, all the Muslims desiring to go to Pakistan were stopped in India. And all the Hindus who wanted to come to India were stopped in Pakistan. And you can see that in a couple of examples from the east of India. Muslims were leaving Assam and West Bengal because, facing a lot of violence, a lot of torture, the Hindus of the region had retaliated. So they were forced to leave the region. But Nehru brought them back, thanks to the Liaquat Nehru Pact. After the partition, in Bengal, many districts saw Muslims leaving. Some of them saw a drop in Muslim population as much as 10% and more. But once the Liaquat Nehru Pact was in motion, those Muslims started coming back. For example, Nadia was 50% Muslim, but after the partition, it became a Hindu majority in 1951. Today, it is 61.26% Muslim. And I'll give you another example. Minority population in Malda and West Dinajpur saw a 10% rise between 1951 and 1961. In West Dinajpur, In 1941, there were 50.20% Muslims. After the partition, the number went down. So in 1951, there were only 29.94% Muslims. But because of the Liaquat Nehru Pact, the number went up. And in 1961, the number rose almost 10% to 39.42%. Similarly, in Malda, in 1941, there were 56.78% Muslims. In 1951, the number went down. After partition, the number went down to 36.97%. Thanks to the Liaquat Nehru Pact, in 1961, the number went up to 46.18%. Now today, that region, the Chicken Neck region, is a very sensitive region because it's a Muslim majority region. And we've recently seen in the last few years a particular radical Muslim leader, political leader, saying that they can go and block the Chicken Neck and completely disconnect the far east side of India from the mainland. This is thanks to the Liaquat Nehru Pact. And what is worse than this is how Nehru treated the Bengali refugees. I'll read you something written by Kanchan Gupta, whose family was one of these refugee families. He writes, "We fled from Muslim League marauders to West Bengal, seeking refuge in India. Nehru showed no compassion. We Bengali Hindus had to sign affidavits declaring ourselves refugees in India. Nehru refused to accord us the status of refugees, as it would entitle us to stay on. He called us migrants and displaced persons. He demanded we go back. Worse, Nehru labelled us permanent liability, put us in filthy camps, and when these shanties were full, crammed hundreds of us in damp, dark, jute godowns with no ventilation. Nehru believed we Bengali Hindu refugees were crossing over to India not to flee rapacious killers of Muslim League, but to feast on his free ration, few kilos of inedible rice. So he ordered a cut and decreed that men were not entitled to it. To discourage West Bengal government from helping us Bengali Hindu refugees, Nehru drastically reduced central funds for the state. Send them back, he told the Chief Minister B.C. Roy. You see, we Bengali Hindus fleeing death had no place in Nehru's idea of India. Nehru signed the shameful Liaquat Nehru Pact to trick us Hindu Bengali refugees into going back, but we clung on to the soil of this land. While Nehru supped and sipped on the finest food and booze, we saw our children starve, our old perish. A livid Nehru ordered Bengali Hindu refugees to be packed off to uninhabited, inhospitable lands. We were transported to work camps, much like Hitler transported Jews to labor camps. Many perished, others survived. For many Bengali Hindu refugees, Nehru decreed Kala Pani. They were sent off to Andamans. Those who had some money wanted to collectively rent land and build homes on the southern fringes of Calcutta. Owners were told not to rent us land. Bengali Hindu refugees were disparagingly labelled permanent liability by Nehru. Refugee camps were called PLCs, or permanent liability camps. This is a lived experience by somebody whose family went through it. So you can just imagine, to create a certain secular international image and to appease the Muslim people, Nehru was happily throwing the Bengali Hindus into death's mouth. And what was the reaction of Nehru when the Hindus wanted to protect their own people? I'll read you an excerpt from my political memoirs by Dr. N.B. Khare, who is the former Chief Minister of Central Province, which is today's Madhya Pradesh. He writes, Ashutosh Lahiri met Pandit Nehru and acquainted him with the sorry tale of Bengali refugees and requested him to render some help to those downtrodden human beings. Pandit Nehru refused to do so, as Pakistan was a foreign country. Lahiri replied, well, you don't do anything. We ourselves will form some armed bands and infiltrate into East Pakistan secretly to help the Hindus over there. You simply connive at it. Pandit Nehru at once flared up and said, if you do so, my army will shoot you from behind. Interesting that he says my army, not Indian army. So the Bengalis wanted to protect the Hindus who were stuck in East Pakistan, which is today's Bangladesh. And Nehru said that if you do so, I'm going to get Indian army to shoot you from behind. Not only did he leave the Hindus to die at the hands of Islamists, and when the Hindus wanted to protect their own people across the border, Nehru said, "No, I'll get you killed." Now contrast this with the treatment that Nehru gave to the Muslims. Because one thing about the Liaquat Nehru Pact that many people do not realize is that it could have been much, much worse. Because Nehru had also agreed to give separate electorates to Muslims and reservation in jobs as well. And I'll read an excerpt from Government from Inside, which was written by Congress leader N.V. Gadgil, who was a minister in the first central cabinet of independent India, and he was later also the governor of Punjab. He writes, Liaquat Ali came to Delhi in March 1950, had discussions with Nehru, and one fine morning at 10 o'clock, Nehru placed before the cabinet a draft of his agreement with him. I'm not sure if Vallabhbhai was consulted before the draft was agreed to. The final two paragraphs in the agreement accepted the principle of reservation for Muslims in proportion to their population in all the services and representative bodies in the constituent states of India. Similar provisions were suggested for the central government also. Each one of us got a copy of the draft, but no one would open his mouth. I said, these two paragraphs nullify the whole philosophy of the Congress. The country had to pay the price of division as a result of its acceptance of separate electorates. You're asking it to drink the same poison again. This is a betrayal, forgetful of the last 40 years of history. Nehru was displeased. The others were pleased, but not one of them dared support me. The discussion went on for half an hour. Gopal Swami Iyengar said, there is substance in Gadgil's objections, and volunteered to redraft the two provisos. I said, these two paragraphs must go lock, stock and barrel, and no South Indian cleverness would do. On this, Nehru replied in anger, I have agreed to this with Liaquat Ali Khan. I said, you must have told him that the agreement can be finalized only after the cabinet's approval. I cannot speak of the other cabinet members, but I'm opposed to it 100%. On this, Vallabhbhai Patel quietly suggested that the discussion should be postponed to the next day, and the meeting was adjourned. Vallabhbhai called me for discussion on return home. I told him, figuratively speaking, the marriage must not take place simply because the father wants it. The bride is not approved. You must speak plainly now, otherwise complications will follow and we may have to repent. We have decided upon a secular government. This agreement destroys that conception. The same night I received from him the papers regarding the revisions suggested by Gopal Swami and his disapproval of them. I noted on them my agreement with him. When the cabinet met the next day, the last two paragraphs were omitted. I wanted to say something about the remaining paragraphs also, but Vallabhbhai said that there need be no more discussion as he had seen them. Thus, if I took credit for saving India from the evil of the repetition of separate electorates, reservations in services, reservation in ministries, etc., it is justifiable. So just to please the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nehru was happy to give Muslims an incredible amount of reservation in jobs, in education, in ministries, etc., not to mention the separate electorates. But this wasn't all. Nehru tried his best to stop the Muslims from leaving India and going to the newly created Islamic nation of Pakistan. And that made the Hindus angry. I'll read an excerpt from the J.L. Kapoor Commission report. This is the testimony of J.L. Sahani, witness 95. Mr. Sahani stated that he never found any anti-refugee feeling in Pandit Nehru, neither in private talks nor otherwise. But the Hindu and Sikh refugees were impressed by the sympathetic efforts which were being made by Sardar Patel, Mr. Gadgil, Sardar Baldev Singh and people of their point of view. Pandit Nehru also was quite sympathetic towards Hindu refugees, but the fact that along with Maulana Azad, Rafi Ahmad Kidwai and other Muslim colleagues, he worked very hard and spared neither money nor time in discouraging Muslim refugees from leaving for Pakistan, preserving their rights to their properties and so forth, created a sense of hostility among refugees towards him, since the refugees genuinely felt that if they had been thrown out of Pakistan, it should be natural for at least an equal number of Muslims to be allowed to migrate, even though there was no proportion between the millions of wealth Hindu community had left behind and what the poorer Muslim community was expected to leave behind if they migrated. When special police was appointed to preserve the rights of Muslims, even for their property, and strong measures were taken, including shooting at Hindu refugees who tried to enter the empty properties of Muslims, this sense of resentment amongst the Hindu refugees became almost blind. Mr. Sahni also said that Mahatma Gandhi out-congressed the Congress in appeasing the Muslims and Pakistan. Refugees who came from West Punjab and Northwest Frontier Province considered that they were coming to their homeland, but they were treated as unwanted people because the idea of Mahatma Gandhi was that they should return to their original homes. Unfortunately, this idea was echoed by lesser leaders who took their cue from the Mahatma, and this made the government very unpopular among the Hindu refugees. And there are plenty of stories like this, that when the Hindu refugees who had come from Pakistan, in the cold of Delhi by the way, when they tried to live in the empty houses and empty masjids and empty dargahs that were left behind the Muslims who happily went to the new Islamic Republic of Pakistan, when the Hindus tried to find shelter with their families, their children, their women in these empty houses that were left behind, Nehru's police shot at them. Imagine being a Punjabi refugee with your family, coming to Delhi, feeling happy that, hey, look, we have escaped from the Muslims, we are alive, we are so lucky to be alive, we've survived so many terrible, terrible things that have happened to us in the last few days. Finally, we are in India, we'll be taken care of, we can finally restart our lives from scratch, but at least we have our family, we have our lives. And then finding an empty house to find shelter in, only to have Nehru's police shooting at you. A whole delegation of Punjabi Hindus even met Nehru with a proposal, with a proper legal proposal to set up a township for refugees. But Nehru did not want Hindu refugees anywhere near Delhi. I'll read you an excerpt from India, from Curzon to Nehru and After, written by Sri Durgadas, who was the former editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times and also the founding president of the Press Club of India. He writes, Mr. Yodhraj, chairman of the Punjab National Bank, began by explaining to Nehru the need for an area of several hundred acres to be set apart for a residential colony at a distance of about 7 miles from Delhi. Pandit Nehru's immediate reaction was one of opposition. He said, "Forget 7 miles, I won't let you come within 700 miles of Delhi." He interjected angrily because of his grievance against the Punjabis, who he thought were responsible for the disturbances in Delhi. He mentioned that these disorders had brought the government a very bad name all over the world and upset their program with regard to certain princely states. As always with Nehru, it was always about impressing the world, or rather impressing the West. He was happy to leave the Punjabis dying in Delhi's cold, shooting at them, refusing to give them land. And there was so much land around Delhi at that time. And I think it's very ironic and very funny rather, that today Delhi is what it is, mostly because of the refugees who had come from Pakistan, from West Pakistan and Northwest Frontier Province. There is another incident that happened around this time that I'd like to mention, and this will give you an idea of why Congress and Nehru and Gandhi were so disliked by the Punjabis who came from Pakistan and their children. Now we all know that after the partition, chaos reigned for Hindus and Sikhs on the Pakistani side of the border, with streams of refugees pouring into India looking for shelter. It was during this tumultuous time that Nehru took to the radio, urging all the refugees to forgive Pakistanis and forgive Muslims for all the atrocities that they had to endure. Nehru also told the Hindu refugees to refrain from seeking revenge. His broadcast echoed across refugee camps in Delhi, Amritsar, Ludhiana, Jalandhar and beyond, and it made the people very angry. The next morning after the radio broadcast, Nehru, accompanied by his daughter Indira, visited one of these camps. As they made their way through the crowd, an elderly man reached out and touched Indira Gandhi's hand, a gesture of affection like that of a grandfather. But Nehru reacted with anger and slapped the old man. He slapped the old man who was the Punjabi Hindu refugee who had escaped from Pakistan. Instead of getting angry, the old man laughed out loud to Nehru's face and said, "You spoke over the radio last night and advised us not to be revengeful, but forgiving towards the people on the other side of the border. Your daughter is like my granddaughter. You yourself are like my son in age. What did I do wrong in touching the hand of your daughter to attract your attention? You slapped me and advised over the radio to calm my anger? Do you know 3 of my daughters were taken away by force by the Pakistanis from my home, and I should not be angry? What gives you the right to slap me just for touching your daughter? Nehru simply moved away from there. Everything that I have discussed in this episode is from direct sources, from the sources of people who were alive at that time, people who were involved in these decisions, in these activities. So if you are a left-leaning person or a Nehru fanboy, fangirl listening to this, I can assure you that I have not used any sources that you would claim to be so-called nationalistic or pro-Hindu or whatever. I'll once again mention the books that I have used for this particular episode of the Indologia Podcast. I have read you excerpts from Savarkar, A Contested Legacy by Vikram Sampath, Unbreaking India by Sanjay Dikshit, the 1961 Census Report of India, My Political Memoirs by Dr. N.B. Khare, Government from Inside by N.V. Gadgil, the J.L. Kapoor Commission Report, and India from Curzon to Nehru and After by Sri Durgadas. You're welcome to pick up these sources, read them for yourself, formulate your own opinion, figure out who the culprit was, who wasn't, and you can also determine for yourself whether Mr. Nehru made these blunders or not. If you liked this podcast, then please give me a nice rating, a nice 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon, or whichever platform you're listening to this on. You should also follow me on social medias. I'm pretty active on Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp. I'm everywhere. The name is the same. It's Indologia, Indologia. If you have any feedback, any critique, any suggestions, please send me a message on Instagram or Twitter. I'm also on YouTube, by the way, and I'm also planning something new for the podcast. Something very exciting will come up in the next month or so. So please subscribe to my YouTube as well. Until the next time I see you, Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.